So this is kind of like the only motherboards they sort of make now are the high-end boards. Now, here's the thing. I've seen a lot of people asking EVGA, are you gonna be making an AM5 board? Are you gonna make an AM5 board? Because remember, EVGA did step into the AMD arena with the X570 stuff, X570 Dark. There was even an X570 Kingpin and a classified, I believe. I'm waiting for that board just like you guys. I'd love to see it, but every time I talk to them, they said, yeah, eventually.
The Phanteks G360A PC case features a mesh front panel for ample airflow, room for full-length GPUs up to 400 millimeters long, 360 millimeter radiator support, and integrated DRGB lighting compatible with all motherboard RGB lighting controllers. To see the full list of specs and colors available, follow the link in the description below.
As you can imagine, there's probably a lot of things happening behind the scenes at EVGA right now as they kind of try and figure out like, okay, we went from an aircraft carrier sized ship of a company now to like a tugboat. Where are we going, you know? And how are we gonna get there? Anyway, moving on. Today we'll just do kind of an unboxing and first look at this Z790, which to be honest with you is probably just gonna look an awful lot like the Z690 because I can't imagine there being a whole lot different. Anyway, moving on. The packaging is never a disappointment with EVGA. First thing I met with is probably gonna be a warranty information card. Yep, oh, installation quick guide. I love how that image right there shows the Z790 board being mounted down with a box cooler from Intel. So anyway, there's that. This should just come off. Okay, that just, the cardboard part didn't want to come out, so I've now unboxed the whole thing. That's fine. So there's the divider there. There's the accessory kit, which we'll look at in a second. And one of the things that you might notice initially with the EVGA motherboards is this is something that the Kingpin edition stuff, the classified and the dark, they're all designed around overclocking, but the Kingpin board typically has like a lot of features you wouldn't find on a lower, and I say lower end board. These are all high end boards, but the lower of the three tiers, the Kingpin boards are gonna come with LN2 overclocking features. You're gonna have things like cold boot. You're gonna have things like hot, I'm not gonna go through the whole feature list, but if you were running LN2 and your CPU's too cold, oftentimes it won't boot. So is a mode that you can enable to allow it to actually go warmer for boot and then go cold. Lots of neat features. But what you're also gonna notice is that they always have this very unique rotated CPU socket. Actually, it does look a little different than the Z690. This is nice. This is so nice. And this is what we miss now with the graphics card stuff. Anyway, as you can see, everything is rotated. So you've got two DIMMs up here, channel A, channel B. I told you in previous videos, high-end overclocking boards typically only have two slots for sticks, and that's because of the fact that it's less stress on the memory controller to have one stick per channel. This is an overclocking feature first and foremost. But the reason why they rotate the whole thing is to have the power delivery system all together and not just on one side of the motherboard. It's actually a shorter trace for power to be able to run directly to the CPU. Again, it's something that Kingpin has started doing the last few generations of their motherboard. They live by this design and it makes for a much cleaner aesthetic as well when you have all of the power cables coming out one side. And I really wish that they made an AM5 board because remember I told you I am running AMD on my new personal rig that I'm gonna be building here sometime soon. I would absolutely love to put an EVGA motherboard back in my system because of the fact that I was running EVGA boards in Skunkworks and it would just kind of be like a nostalgia thing for me. But they don't make an AM5 motherboard yet, and based on the conversations I've had, I don't think we're gonna have one coming very soon. So moving on. I'm gonna set this aside for a second. I wanna talk about some of the other things that you get feature set with it. Every Kingpin motherboard comes with what just looks like a PCB, but it's not, it's just made out of PCB type material. This is like a test bench stand. Not only is it a test bench stand, it's also a blueprint layout of where everything is on the board. So you can see here's your chipset right here. You can kind of see how the traces go. You can see what I mean about the power delivery going right to the socket. Your VRM phase design. You can see right here where your 3 NVMe drives would go. All your SATA plugs and SATA ports over here on the side. If you ever wanna know where something is on your motherboard, this is essentially a roadmap to your motherboard. But as you can see with these holes here, it comes with long standoffs that would allow you to be able to take your motherboard and set it on this. That way, if you were doing things like bench testing, overclocking or whatever, you don't have to mount it down to some sort of a chassis. You can just use this with this standoff kit, which is actually really nice. This is not cheap to include, and every single EVGA motherboard, especially the Kingpin and like the classified stuff or the dark, comes with this, which is really nice. Moving on to the accessory set, which I gotta tell you, it feels a little lighter in this box than we typically see. But, like I said, things are changing. Here are those standoffs I was telling you about. And when I say long standoffs, I wasn't kidding. The idea here is that you can get it up high enough off of the test bench that you can run a socket heater to the backside if you need to. Again, L2 overclockers understand the importance of keeping the backside of the socket from freezing over, so you could have room to run a heater there, cables under there, you can sit drives under there, or whatever. It also allows more airflow for underneath the motherboard, which is something to consider too when you start pushing a stupid amount of voltage to the CPU. Here is every time I see this antenna, it's so big. It's like, first of all, it's this big because they turned it into the EVGA-E, which I think is a little cheesy, but whatever. It's designed to be a desk mount for your antennas, and then you can obviously swivel this around to rabbit ear it wherever you want. We have our metal case badge right here, which is one of the nicer case badges you would ever see that comes with the motherboard. These are your M.2 hold down screws with nice big collars on there. This is something that's always nice to see with motherboards. Again, only if you're an overclocking enthusiast, which if you don't know who Kingpin is, then you wouldn't understand, I guess, why all this overclocking features is built in. This is for your probes, and this is to give you voltage readout for any particular portion of the motherboard that you want to read, whether it be at the VRMs, at the memory controller, at CPU. Usually core voltage is what you'd be monitoring. So instead of trying to like somehow probe the motherboard to see what physical voltage is, which is going to be the most accurate way to monitor voltage rather than software readout, is to plug this into the side of the motherboard, and then you just use the appropriate pinouts here to set your probe in to monitor your voltage. That has been coming with the EVGA motherboards for a while now. Really nice metal USB disc. This is for our drivers and stuff. Thank God it's not a CD or ROM anymore, which it used to be for the longest time. And then 2 packs of SATA cables. They are all 180-degree cables, so there's no 90 degrees on there. As you can see, they're all straight, which is kind of nice to see. But then again, sometimes you need the 90 or the 90 degrees if you have the SSD or the hard drive mounted on a normal cage. You got the back of the panel right there. The 90 makes it nice clean. You don't have those with here, they're all 180s. And that's it. You used to get a ton of extra stuff with the motherboards, but I think maybe EVGA's kind of maybe realized that a lot of that stuff people don't necessarily utilize or use, and it's added cost to add it into the motherboard set, added cost for them anyway. Trust me, these motherboards still cost a fortune. That way they're gonna stop including it if people aren't using it. Look at the back of the motherboard. It's the details like this that you never get to see. In fact, if I was to peel this off a little bit, you can see that's like a brushed metal. It is beautiful, but you never get to see the backside, which is unfortunate. You got this dark cutout right here, Z790 dark Kingpin, which looks fantastic. The front side, Kingpin loves the gold showing. I am not a fan of the gold. Kingpin loves the gold. It's his board. Obviously, that's what he's gonna go with. But you got the gold Kingpin logo right there. There's kind of a gunmetal-y cover here for the chipset, which is also the heatsink. We've got this right here where it says dark. This is not just a design. This is actually where the M.2 is, which means there's 3 drives under there, and this will touch those drives and give passive heatsink cooling. So let me get my tool so I can open that up. Now, this is like the ultimate M.2 cooler because it is a cover, it is a heatsink, it has a design in it, it's anodized. So obviously the heatsink or the heat pad, the thermal pad on here is the length of a 2280 drive, which is standard SSDs. You have these 3 holes here, which is where these hold downs would go for the M.2. I kind of wish that these were pre-installed, just maybe it's a manpower thing. So you put your drives on there. You also have a heatsink cover or heatsink pad on this side, which ironically is the full length. But anyway, you would have active cooling on both sides of your drive. So if you have a double stacked SSD, what I mean by that is like you have chips on the back and the top, so on both sides, you would have a thermal pad touching both sides, and you've got this nice long heat piece of metal at least to sort of disperse some of that heat. But most of the heat you'll find coming on the top right here. And then this is your heatsink to keep that nice and cool. The only downside by having the cover this way is instead of individual covers, if you needed to access your drive, you have to remove your graphics card. So for instance, if this one maybe independently was separate, you could get that one off with a standard like 2.5 slot. I guess what graphics card's 2 slot these days, but anyway, if you're running a standard size card, you could still get to the drive without having to take the graphics card out. that may not sound like that big of a deal unless you have a water-cooled graphics card, especially if it's got rigid pipes. Then you are going through quite the hassle to access your drive. You'd have to drain your loop, take your card off, hope you don't drip it all over the place and make a mess, just to get to your SSD. But Jay, why would I have to get to my SSD? Well, if you want to add one. A lot of times people will just put in enough that enough storage to get you by. Maybe you have enough storage to get you by, but you want to add more. Well, you got to take your graphics card off to get to it. Not usually going to be that big of an issue, but it kind of might be for some people. A lot of folks have asked me, what is this? Like, what's the point of this guy right here? This is actually how you do the BIOS flash on an EVGA motherboard. This is how you would access their BIOS flash feature. For a flashback. A lot of motherboards now, you can flash the BIOS on the motherboard if it borks or breaks in some way. Let's say an update fails, you could plug a USB right into that, don't even need a CPU in the socket, and it'd be able to do a BIOS flash. So you need to kind of go through the manual to figure out how to do it on this particular motherboard. But you can see right here on the back, there's the BIOS update button, a clear CMOS button. So this is what you would use to actually activate the BIOS flash off of that. Here's our antennas right here. We've got a lot of SSDs, or super speed USBs, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So we got 7 of them. We've also got a USB-C, and we have a 2.5 gig and a 10 gig NIC built in here. But in terms of just connectivity, you kind of get all the basics that you're looking for here. One of the things that the Kingpin and the classified / dark motherboards are known for is having these individual dip switches. And this is for turning off PCIe lanes. Now, because we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 there, and we only have a 16X slot there and a 16X slot there, and then you've got 3 NVMEs, those NVMEs are actually utilizing PCI Express lanes. So you can turn off the NVMEs by using those switches as well. That could potentially be a voltage thing if you needed it. I'm not entirely sure why, but regardless, you can turn them off. Back in the day, when I had like 3 graphics cards on my classified motherboards and such, I could turn those off individually if I just wanted to, like, hey, I just want to flip off that other card, not unplug the power or do any like pulling out the SLI bridge or whatever. I could just turn off the dip switches and then the system would just ignore that card on the next boot, and I could go through and play games with single card if I wanted to do testing and stuff. It was actually really nice to have. But in terms of layouts, I wish more motherboard manufacturers did this. Do you see this right up here? We've got 1, 2, 3, 4 addressable RGB headers clumped together. So this makes cable management very nice and tidy if you have them all coming from the same area. Next to that, we have our, this is for AIO. It's designed as a pump header. Typically all that means is that it can handle more amps, because pumps tend to draw more amps than fans do. We've got our clear CMOS button right there. We also have a clear CMOS on the back, by the way. So that's just handy if you're doing bench testing to clear your CMOS. Dual Q code readout, which will give us both temperature readings and BIOS and post status as it's booting. Power reset. Like I said, we've already got our power all on one side, along with our USB-C right there, so you can have some of the tightest cable management possible on these boards. And then everything else, as you can see, is just right here at the bottom. 2 USB 2.0 headers right there, and then 2 more fan headers. This right here is a 6-pin supplemental power that you would find for your PCI Express lanes. This was something that was needed in the older graphics cards that would utilize the full 75 watts from the PCI Express lane. But the problem was, if you were doing like 1080 Ti Kingpin SLI LN2 overclocked, and you had both these cards pulling the full 75 watts from each of these PCI Express sockets, you could end up having a lot of droop over because it's just taking it through the PCB traces in the motherboard. So this was just designed to give extra supplemental power that was direct to these lanes right here without having to pull it from all the way over here across the motherboard to the PCI Express lanes. This is kind of not needed anymore because of the fact that 40 series graphics cards, 4090s and 4080s, even though 4090s and 3090 Ti's are 450 watt cards, they utilize very little power from the socket, like maybe 20 watts at the most now. So this is kind of an obsolete thing, but it's just nice to still see there. Now it might not seem like there's a whole lot of connectivity, and that's because the rest of the stuff is actually located underneath these little rubber covers right here. If we pop this off, we'll actually access a few other things. That is our front panel connector right there. This over here is our 4X PCI Express lane, and then we have our HD audio right there. So it's nice to see these little covers for things that you may not be using. That way they just stay pretty looking without sitting there collecting dust for no reason whatsoever. This cover, Jay, why would you need a cover for the front panel connector? You have to plug it into something. Remember, this board is probably gonna spend, for most people, its life sitting on a test bench doing LN2 overclocking and stuff. So you wouldn't need access to this stuff. You have these buttons for it. So there you go. That is the look at the Kingpin Z790 Dark. Man, I hope these stick around. That's all I'm gonna say. Who knows what the future brings for EVGA. It is still a very uncertain future. I think, you know, in our meeting with EVGA, they sounded an awful lot like, the leadership anyway, sounded very much like they kind of knew what they were doing, they were prepared for it. Ultimately, the market is gonna decide, because they also said that only like 3% of their business came from motherboards. So I really hope that we continue to see these types of designs around, because remember, for this type of design to exist, it took folks like Vince Kingpin, you know, to design this stuff. And he needs to obviously be around with the company to continue designing this sort of stuff. So again, this is just me kind of talking out loud, hoping that we don't see this sort of stuff disappear, because as an enthusiast, this is very niche, but I like to see this sort of stuff. Like, I like to look at fancy multi-million-dollar cars that I'll never be able to afford in my life. I still like to see them, even though I know I can never have it. So there you go. Sign off down below how you guys feel about this. Design aesthetically, it does look a little bit different than the Z690. The entire reason why this board is here is because this is what's going in the EVGA tribute board, or build, with the E1 case. And you might be wondering, Jay, what's happening with that? Is it another system that's gonna take you 15 years to build? No, I'm waiting for the power board to come. Singularity Computers has been designing and building a custom distribution block for water cooling, as well as a power board, similar to what I showed on their Spectre case, for the E1. Once I get that, then that build can commence, and that will become my new system that I use here at work. All right, guys, thanks for watching. Hope you guys have enjoyed this unboxing and first look at what is one of the most beautiful motherboards, in my opinion, that I hope will continue to live on. Thanks for watching, guys. We'll see you in the next one.